Chapter 2. What did you say your name was, dear? Constance almost sighed, but to do so would have been impolite. She had already introduced herself to Mrs. Clark twice. Constance Majolo. And you are a lawyer? Mrs. Clark asked. Yes, I am, Constance replied. I graduated from the university at the end of the academic term last year. But you look so very young, Mrs. Clark said, looking at Constance through her old eyes. Just like policemen. Ma? My little joke, dear. They do say that when policemen start to look very young, we must be getting very old, Mrs. Clark replied. Well, it isn't only policemen. Everyone seems very young these days. Except Jacob. Jacob? Constance asked. Jacob. My gardener, Mrs. Clark replied. Didn't you see him when you arrived? Didn't he open the gate for you? The gate was open, Constance replied. Then he must have gone out, Mrs. Clark explained. Perhaps Piketty sent him to the shops. One can't get out myself these days. You understand, I'm sure. Constance looked at the woman. Mrs. Clark looked weak and sick. Her hair had turned white. Her face and forehead were wrinkled, the skin on her face and on her hands was yellow and seemed very thin. Blood vessels showed clearly through the skin. I don't have long to live, Mrs. Clark said. She looked deep into Constance's eyes. She wanted to see how the young lawyer responded. I'm sorry to hear that, Mrs. Clark, Constance replied. Thank God for an honest answer, Mrs. Clark said. Ma? When I tell people I am dying, they tell me I will live forever. They say I am talking nonsense, but you, my dear, you do not waste my time with nonsense of that kind. I feel sympathy for you, Constance said. Mrs. Clark was thin. She seemed to have hardly any flesh on her bones. Even when sitting in a comfortable chair, as now, she rested on a walking stick. It is time to make my last will and testament, the old woman said. While there's still time. I've brought the forms with me, Constance replied. I shall need your signature, my own, and that of one other person. 2 witnesses? Mrs. Clark asked. Usually, 1 witness is enough, Constance replied, but I think it is better to be safe. Don't you? Whatever you suggest, dear, Mrs. Clark told Constance. And then asked, do you specialize in wills and testaments? I do whatever I am asked to do, Constance said. But I know all about the subject. We studied everything at the university. It cannot be the most exciting kind of work, Mrs. Clark said. Taking instructions from an old bag of bones like me. She laughed a little. It was a dry kind of laugh that quickly turned into a cough. I'll do all that's required, Constance told the old woman. I am sure that you will, dear. I'm sure you will, Mrs. Clark assured her. But first, I think we must have a cup of tea. Piketty, Mrs. Clark's voice was not very strong, but the house was quiet and the maid heard the call. She came in from the kitchen. Tea for 2, Piketty, Mrs. Clark said. And she turned to Constance. Did you have someone with you? My assistant, Mr. Ndlovu. He's in the kitchen, Piketty said. Give him tea as well, Mrs. Clark told her. Right. Constance noted immediately that the maid did not refer to Mrs. Clark as a madam. There seemed to be an easy relationship between the maid and her employer. Where's Jacob? Mrs. Clark asked. Gone to town, Piketty replied. We need some vegetables. Mrs. Clark nodded. You cannot blame me for that, either of you. These days, I eat less than a small bird. She laughed again. Piketty smiled too. Then she went to the kitchen to prepare tea. And now, Constance, you see, I remembered your name this time. You have questions to ask me, don't you? If you wish to wait, Constance said. Wait. Until you've had a cup of tea, Constance answered. No, you may begin now, Mrs. Clark replied. There's no point in wasting time. I suppose I am paying Peter Tembisa by the hour. Not on this one, Constance said. Making out a last will and testament, there's a fixed fee for such work. Well, I'm very pleased to hear that, Mrs. Clark said, very pleased indeed. She may be old and weak, Constance thought, but Mrs. Clark has not lost the power of her mind. She still retains a good sense of humor. Constance needed to complete details of name and address first. Your surname is Clark? Constance asked. Yes, dear, C-L-A-R, Kate Clark. What are your first or Christian names? Emily Louise. Were you ever married? Or are you married now? Mrs. Clark coughed briefly. At that moment, Piketty came from the kitchen carrying a tray on which there were cups and saucers, milk, sugar, teaspoons, and a teapot covered so as to keep the tea warm. Piketty put the tray down. Without waiting to be asked, she poured tea. I can do that myself, you know, Mrs. Clark said. I am not completely useless. Not yet. And not quite. The last time you poured, you made a mess all over the floor, Piketty said quietly, still pouring tea for both Mrs. Clark and Constance. She left Constance to add her own milk and sugar but saw to Mrs. Clark's needs. Mrs. Clark had trouble holding the cup and saucer still at first. The cup rattled noisily. After a time, however, she solved the problem by putting the saucer down and using only the cup. You always make a good cup of tea, Piketty, she said. I'll get some biscuits, Piketty replied. Would you like cakes and biscuits, Miss Constance Majolo? But please call me Constance. Yes, I'd love some biscuits. Piketty returned to the kitchen. Constance drank her tea. Then she put her cup and saucer down and picked up her pen. Now where was I? She said aloud to herself. You were asking if I am married, or was ever married, Mrs. Clark reminded her. Oh yes, of course, Constance replied, I was married. But I became a widow. I see, Constance said, writing. What was the year of your husband's death? Do you need to know that kind of thing? Mrs. Clark asked, sounding, for the first time, just a little irritable. Constance drank some more tea before answering. Piketty came back with biscuits and cake. Only when the maid had left the room again did Constance speak. The position is this, Mrs. Clark. Your husband is the next of kin while he's alive. That means he's your closest relative. I know what next of kin means, Constance, Mrs. Clark replied, but she did not sound rude when she said these words. I'm sorry, Constance said, but I have told you already. I am a widow, Mrs. Clark went on, her voice very soft. Yes, of course. That means I shall need to see proof of Mr. Clark's death. You do have a death certificate, I suppose. Mrs. Clark drew in breath. She appeared to be thinking very hard. If you don't have a copy, we can always get another one, Constance said. Did your husband die in this city? Did he? Yes, of course. Then there shouldn't be a problem, Constance assured the old woman. If you can find the certificate, we can get another. How much do they cost? Not much, Constance replied. They are very cheap, really. Jacob and Piketty will help me to search, Mrs. Clark said. After Constance had made a note of these details, she asked Mrs. Clark if she had written down her instructions, or if she wished to dictate them. I'll tell you, dear, Mrs. Clark said. It's all quite simple, really. Constance drained her cup. Would you like more tea? Mrs. Clark asked, leaning forward, as if she were going to try and pour. I'll do it, Constance said. She poured more tea for both Mrs. Clark and herself. As she did so, she found time to glance at her wristwatch. She did this in such a way that Mrs. Clark did not notice. She took a chocolate-covered biscuit too. She really had enough money to buy fancy things like sweets and biscuits. The rent on her flat took much of her monthly salary. As a new member of Tembisa and Associates, Constance did not yet earn a large salary. Things would change later, of course. One day, she would be a partner in a company of lawyers, and possibly even have her own business. Okay, I'm ready. Constance said briskly. She saw a look of pain cross Mrs. Clark's face. Are you? May I help? It's all right, dear. I am fine. It's just that I cannot stand that awful term. Okay. Everybody uses it these days, Constance said. I know, Mrs. Clark replied. Kitty uses it. Jacob uses it. I even use it myself sometimes. She smiled. Sorry, Constance said, and she smiled too. Mrs. Clark coughed in order to clear her throat. I'm not sure how much money I have, she said, but it comes to several thousands. There's this house and the plot on which it stands. I have papers to prove that I'm the owner. She paused for breath. She drank a little more tea. That seemed to give her strength. I wish to leave everything I own, money and the house and land, to my only son, Daniel Clark. Constance wrote everything down carefully. Do you have other children, Mrs. Clark? I've just told you, girl. My only son, Daniel. No daughters, Constance said. No daughters at all, Mrs. Clark agreed. Just Daniel. Everything to Daniel, then, Constance said. Is that correct? Yes, but with a few qualifications, Mrs. Clark said. Daniel gets the house. If he is dead, or if he dies before me, and that's not likely to happen, then the house, and all my money, go equally to Kitty and Jacob. Do you have other relatives? Constance asked. Why do you ask that question? If Daniel isn't alive, or if he dies before you, those relatives might argue. They'll say that the money and the house must go to them, as relatives, and not to your two employees. Who I leave my money to is my business, Mrs. Clark said sharply. Your relatives could take the matter to court, Constance said again. Mrs. Clark drew in breath as deeply as she could. Like many old people, she could not always breathe easily. I have no living relatives that I know of. Only Daniel. And I don't even know if he never gets in touch with me. When did you last have contact with your son, Mrs. Clark? Constance asked. You'll be surprised, dear. More than 20 years ago. Constance was surprised. Yet she knew that white people do not always have the strong family connections of other people. Have you any idea of his present address? We will need to get in contact with him after, when I am dead. Mrs. Clark completed the sentence. Do not be afraid to speak plainly, Constance. I'm sorry, Mrs. Clark. But there's another thing, Mrs. Clark continued. Daniel gets the house. But he must agree to allow both Jacob and Kitty to stay here for as long as they wish. They must both have accommodation here. Do you have other accommodation? Constance asked. Apart from the house itself. There are servants' quarters at the back, Mrs. Clark said. In the usual way, Kitty would stay there. But she lives in the house and Jacob occupies her quarters. I understand, Constance said, making notes. She could see that Mrs. Clark needed assistance from Kitty. There were many things that a woman could do to help her. I'll get all this typed up, Constance said when she had completed everything. That will be done today. Tomorrow, I'll return and we can both sign the papers. That will make everything legal. Mrs. Clark nodded her agreement. There is one other thing, Constance, she said. Yes. Do you know this city well? Very well, Constance replied. Well, my request to you is this, my dear. I want you to find Daniel for me. I want you to find my son before I die. Will you do that for me, Constance?